In the heart of a decaying forest stood a cemetery that time had long since forgotten. Overgrown with creeping vines and choked by dense fog, the crumbling headstones seemed to whisper secrets lost to history. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the place, warning curious souls to steer clear. It was said that those who disturbed the graves in this cemetery would awaken the dead. The legend was known far and wide, but most dismissed it as nothing more than a ghost story, a tale to scare children. Except for Emma, a folklore student with a thirst for the truth behind ancient myths. She had heard about the cemetery from a dusty old journal she discovered in the university archives, written by an explorer named Gerald Winters in the early 1900s. He detailed strange occurrences, claiming the dead in this cemetery would rise if their eternal rest was disrupted. Emma, intrigued and skeptical, set out to find the cemetery with her two friends, Jack and Laura. They weren't as convinced as she was about the legend, but joined her for the thrill of exploring something so taboo. The sky was overcast when they set off, the air thick with the scent of rain. The three walked deeper into the forest, navigating through the underbrush and pushing aside gnarled branches. The journey seemed longer than expected, as though the woods themselves were conspiring to make them turn back. Eventually they stumbled upon the cemetery, a decrepit iron gate half open as if inviting them in. "I can't believe we found it," Jack muttered, adjusting his backpack. "It looks worse than I imagined." Laura shivered, not from the cold but from the unsettling aura that seemed to cling to the air. "I don't like this place, Emma. Something feels off." Emma was already walking ahead, her eyes scanning the moss-covered headstones. "This is perfect," she whispered to herself, pulling out her camera to document the cemetery. "We'll make history." Jack and Laura exchanged uneasy glances but followed her in. The cemetery was eerily silent. No birds chirped, no wind rustled the trees. It was as though the world outside had faded away, leaving only the cemetery and its unwilling visitors. The trio moved cautiously, stepping over broken tombstones and crumbling statues of angels that now seemed more sinister than serene. "Look at this one," Emma called out, crouching next to a grave with an intricate carving of a skeletal hand gripping a cross. The inscription read, "Here lies Edward Grimes, 1835 to 1892. Disturb not his eternal slumber." Jack chuckled nervously. "That's comforting." Emma, undeterred, began brushing away the dirt and debris from the grave with her hands, eager to uncover more. She didn't notice the faint tremor beneath the earth, or the way the wind seemed to howl suddenly, as though warning them to stop. "I think we've seen enough," Laura said, her voice shaking. "This place is giving me the creeps." Emma, still focused on the grave, muttered, "Just a little longer, I want to see if—" Suddenly, the ground beneath her shifted. The dirt seemed to bubble and Emma stumbled back in shock. The earth cracked open at the base of the tombstone and from the dark soil, a hand, skeletal and rotting, shot out. Laura screamed. Jack froze, eyes wide with disbelief as the ground split open further. The corpse of Edward Grimes began to rise, dirt and rot falling away from his decayed form. His hollow eye sockets seemed to lock onto Emma, who stood paralyzed in horror. "We need to get out of here," Jack yelled, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her away from the grave. But it was too late. More graves began to stir, the ground shifting and groaning as the dead awakened from their eternal slumber. Skeletal figures, some barely more than bone, others with remnants of flesh clinging to them, clawed their way out of the earth. The air was filled with the sound of cracking bones and the grotesque squelch of decaying flesh. The once peaceful cemetery had become a nightmare. The dead were rising. "Run!" Laura screamed, bolting toward the gate. Emma, shaken from her shock, turned to flee with Jack and Laura, but the cemetery seemed to be alive now, as if the very ground were conspiring against them. The fog thickened, obscuring their path, and the iron gate they had entered through was no longer visible. "We're trapped!" Jack shouted, his voice filled with panic as he swung his flashlight wildly around, the beam flickering as though the batteries were dying. The dead moved slowly but with terrifying purpose, their empty eyes following the living as they stumbled through the graves. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling heavier as if the cemetery was trying to drag her into the earth with the corpses. "This way!" Laura shouted, spotting what looked like a break in the fog. They sprinted toward it, but as they neared, the earth caved in beneath Jack's feet. He let out a cry as he was swallowed by the ground, his body disappearing into the dirt. "Jack!" Emma screamed, but when she tried to go after him, Laura pulled her back. "We can't!" Laura sobbed. "He's gone, Emma! We have to get out of here!" Emma's mind was spinning, disbelief and horror warring inside her. Jack's cries had stopped, replaced only by the soft groans of the dead as they continued to rise, their skeletal hands reaching for the living. They ran, ducking between crumbling headstones and toppling monuments, the cemetery seeming to shift around them. Every time they thought they had found a way out, another grave opened, another corpse crawled its way into their path. The fog was suffocating, and Emma could feel the cold breath of the dead on her neck, the scent of decay wrapping around her like a shroud. Laura tripped over a root, falling hard to the ground. Emma turned to help her, but before she could reach her, a skeletal hand wrapped around Laura's ankle. The dead were pulling her into the ground, their bony fingers tearing at her flesh as she screamed. "Emma, help me!" Laura's voice was high-pitched, desperate. Emma reached out, but more corpses were rising, closing in on her from all sides. She was surrounded. "Emma!" Laura's scream echoed, but then it was gone, replaced by the sickening sound of bones snapping and flesh tearing. Emma backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no escape. The dead were everywhere now, crawling from their graves, hungry for the living. Emma turned in circles, trapped, hopeless. The cemetery had claimed her friends. Now it was coming for her. As the skeletal hands closed in, she fell to her knees, the weight of the dead pressing in around her, and she realized the truth. No one left the forgotten cemetery, not alive, and soon she would join them.